Well, hello, everybody. Um, my name is Adam Smith. I'm the director of the Rothermere American Institute, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here for the inaugural lecture by this year's John G. Winant Professor of American Government, Professor Kimberley Johnson. Before I introduce Professor Johnson, I want to acknowledge the extraordinary generosity of the late Rivington Winant and his wife, Joan, who endowed this visiting professorship in honor of Rivington's father, John Gilbert Winant, a progressive Republican governor of New Hampshire, a New Dealer, who was appointed ambassador to the court of St. James by FDR in the midst of the Blitz, quickly forming a close alliance with Churchill and the King. Both in public and private, Winant did more than anyone to forge the basis for the Anglo-American alliance based on a shared defense of liberal democracy, which endured for 82 years. Ambassador Winant observed an editorial in the Times in 1942 has become a symbol of the best side of America. So highly esteemed was Winant in wartime Britain that Clement Attlee drafted him to help avert a threatened strike among coal miners. Speaking at the Durham Miners' Gala in the summer of 1942, Winant channeled the rhetoric of Franklin Roosevelt to make a case for the democratic purpose of the war. This is the people's democracy, he said. We must keep it wide and vigorous, alive to need of whatever kind and ready to meet it, whether it be danger from without or well-being from within, always remembering that it is the things of the spirit that in the end prevail, that in daring to live dangerously, we are learning to live generously. And at the RAI here in Oxford, we're proud to host a professorship named for Ambassador Winant and the best side of America, and proud too of the very distinguished roster of political scientists who have held the chair since its creation. And there's been no one more distinguished than Professor Johnson, Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University, the author of Reforming Jim Crow, 2010, and Governing the American State, 2007, many articles on American political development and its intersection with racial and ethnic politics. She's just completed a book called Dark Concrete, Black Power, Urbanism, and the American Metropolis, which will come out in December with Cornell University Press. So the way this will work is that Professor Johnson will deliver her lecture. We'll then have a short amount of time for questions and answers here, and then you're all warmly invited to join us for a glass of wine in the foyer outside. And so now it's my very great pleasure to invite Professor Johnson to deliver the 2025 John G. Winant Lecture in American Government, entitled The End of Black Politics, with an intriguing asterisk.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the honor of delivering this talk. First, I would like to extend my thanks to the Winant family for enabling this incredible opportunity. I would also like to thank the Rothermere American Institute for its hosting of me for the academic year. And I also want to thank members of the Oxford community who have welcomed me, especially Balliol College. A quick addendum. I also want to dedicate this speech to my grandmother, who was born in Kingston, Jamaica in 1906. And I don't think she would ever have imagined me standing here. So I'm incredibly proud and honored to be here. Second, I will say that first, I have no idea what's going on in American politics right now. Like, you have as much of an answer as I do. As I've been telling many people, it's an intellectually interesting time for people who study American politics and political science. But my hope is that this lecture today will be a part of trying to understand what's going on. So the election of Donald Trump in November 2024 was also by definition the the defeat of Kamala Harris. As the Trump administration engages in its expansive attempt to remake the American state and the post-Obama world order, it seems a bit beside the point to think about the meaning, if any, of Harris's defeat, given the rapid changes that are happening at this moment. Within the past month, the Trump administration has moved to aggressively dismantle what some have called the civil rights state. And just as an example, you can look at the 3 executive orders issued over the course of January 20th and 21st, in addition to Doge's dismantling those elements of the administrative state that do not comport with his anti-DEI campaign, his defunding of federally funded research that triggers the keyword watch list, and as of February 14th, the Department of Education's Dear Colleague letter. So I'm going to argue that the history I'm going to recount here today perhaps offers us a way of thinking through this moment. I suggest that the Harris defeat, as well as Trump 2.0, allows us a lens to both understand not only the future development of American politics, but the ways in which past developments have led to this critical juncture point. So in this talk, I'm going to sketch out the rise and fall of what I call Black politics. I argue that Black politics was a function of the mid to late 20th century political and state development. And I would also maybe argue that not understanding the rise and decline of Black politics made the Democratic Party misjudge the depth and breadth of its support, as well as the breadth of its opposition. The second purpose of this historical account is to perhaps discern some historical possibilities that may prove instructive as we embark in this new political era. So what do I mean by Black politics? Put simply, I define Black politics as the political practices, ideologies, and movements that are rooted in the experiences, struggles, and interests of Black individuals and communities. Black politics seeks to address both historical and contemporary issues, aiming for the empowerment and liberation of Black people. It is shaped by intersectionality, the intersection of race, class, religion, gender, sexuality, migration status. Black politics can take many formal as well as informal, singular as well as overlapping practices, from rebellion and marronage to grassroots activism, including rent strikes, boycotts, protest marches, to participation in formal political structures like electoral politics and office holding. And now any definition of Black politics must acknowledge that defining who or what is Black is fraught with both social and political controversy. Race or racial definitions are both politically and socially constructed. In the American case, however, race, when applied to people of Asian or Latin American descent, has been the subject of litigation. By contrast, the definition of Blackness has been fairly stable for generations as a product of the US's embrace via the legacy of chattel slavery, of hypodescent, or the one-drop rule. Black politics rests on and is intertwined with civil rights politics, even as it exhibits its own characteristics. They are, in many ways, two sides of the same coin. So what I'm going to argue here and hopefully take you through is that Black politics is the product of 4 developments. First, the progressive era impact on the American federal system, which enhances the role of states as laboratories of democracy. The 20th century transformation of the separation of power system with its ascendant judiciary and executive. The mass urbanization and industrialization of the US, cresting by 1930, and the great migration of African Americans from South to across the US from 1910 to 1970. Together, these developments create the conditions for Black politics to emerge. In turn, the rise of Black politics will play a role in reshaping the political and institutional development of the American state. All right, so given the short time that I have and probably your limited patience for me to present 100 years or so of American political history, I'm going to try to just briefly sketch out what I see as 5 key moments in the history of Black politics. First, I'm going to talk briefly about the nadir or the end of post-emancipation politics and the instantiation of the Jim Crow order centered on the South, but spread across the US. Second, the emergence of Black politics in a period roughly spanning 1910 to 1945. And third, the balance of power era, roughly spanning 1950 to 1965, which marks the emergence of both post-war liberalism and the civil rights movement. And fourth, the Black Power era, roughly 1965 to 1980, which I argued reshaped American liberalism and the American party system. And then finally, the neoliberal era from 1980 to 2008 with the Obama coda of 2008 to 2016. That's a lot to cover. I'm going to try to sort of plow through it, hopefully not speak too quickly, but here we go. So I start with the exit, if you will. Hopefully this works. All right, well, imagine there's another slide. So the historian Rayford Logan called the era from the end of Reconstruction to 1901 the nadir of American politics, American political life. In the South, the Jim Crow order rested on the civic and social death of Black Americans. How did this come about? Lots of things happened during this particular decade of 1890 to 1901. We could start with the failure of the Lodge Force Act of 1890, or the Federal Elections Bill, which was an attempt to provide for the federal regulation of elections to the United States, to the House of Representatives, which had heretofore been regulated by state governments. The bill would have permitted federal circuit courts to appoint federal supervisors for congressional elections and all sorts of things. In many ways, it's almost a precursor of the enforcement mechanisms that were created in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The second sort of moment that happened in 1895 was Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise speech. This was really the first clear declaration of the policy of accommodationism. And the speech is most famous for two sentences. First, Washington states that in all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet on the one hand, yet as the hand, yet separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand, in all things essential to mutual progress. The second sentence, the opportunity to earn $1 in a factory just now is worth infinitely more than the opportunity to spend $1 in an opera house. This policy of accommodationism was not received unanimously by other African Americans, certainly those located out in the South, especially people like W.E.B. Du Bois, also were very much anti-accommodationist. In 1896, this is where probably the most critical moment happens, which is the Supreme Court decision of Plessy v. Ferguson, which creates separate and equal. Other things that happen is Ida B. Wells flees north in 1892, and as a result of the lynching of her partners. And then other things, for example, like the Wilmington Massacre of 1898, which is essentially a coup which overturned the local government of Wilmington, of whites overturning Black rule. And this moment is sort of capped, if you will, by the exit of the last Black congressman, Representative George Henry White, Republican of North Carolina, in 1901. And I just want to just briefly state a little bit of his speech, because I think it really sort of shows this kind of profound loss, this profound death of Black political life at this moment. So he says, "This, Mr. Chairman, is perhaps the Negro's temporary farewell to the American Congress. But let me say, Phoenix-like, he will rise up someday and come again. These parting words are in behalf of an outraged, heartbroken, bruised and bleeding, but God-fearing people, faithful, industrious, loyal people, rising people, full of potential force." And so ends Black political life in the South. But something happens a mere 10 or so years later, which is the Great Migration. The Great Migration triggers significant shifts in not only where, but how Black Americans live. Although ultimately 6 million African Americans would leave the South, the first wave of migration during this sort of early period of 1910 to about 1918, you see at least 500,000 to 1 million people moving to points northward. If I had my slides, what you would see is a great map of this enormous movement of people from the South to North, to the Northeast, to Chicago, and out west to San Francisco and LA. Oh, wow. How very exciting. We love technology. Okay. So just I really briefly, a couple of the numbers for example, New York City increases, all these cities have increases of 50 to 100,000 in Black population. So it's really this extraordinary movement. You can see on the charts that places like New York City, Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, Los Angeles are really the sort of big winners in this movement of African Americans out of the South. Migration was not easy. Local groups, including Black settlement houses, scrambled to help migrants settle, while new organizations like the National Urban League emerged to coordinate an organized response to migration and help migrants acculturate to urban life. Migration certainly wasn't welcome. It was initially met with political violence of the Red Summer of 1919, with at least 38 race riots, leaving hundreds dead and millions in property damage, and the nationwide resurgence as well as spread of the KKK. Nevertheless, there were, again, important things that happened that emerged at the beginning of this migration. First is a cultural shift. World War I creates a new sense of empowerment as Black soldiers returned from Europe, arguing that they had done their part for fighting for democracy. In addition, a new Negro movement emerges. We now call that the Harlem Renaissance, as well as the Chicago Renaissance. And again, we get the establishment of civic groups like the NAACP, the National Urban League, as well as Black labor organizations such as the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters as well. And within the veil of the Jim Crow city, or what the historian Earl Lewis calls the congregation spaces, created within the walls of segregation, was the creation of a modern Black counterpublic of shared purpose, meaning, and communications. In Black churches, civic organizations, the Black press, Black leisure and entertainment, businesses, fraternal organizations, and mutual aid societies. What also helps shape this early moment is that mass European immigration comes to a virtual stop in 1924 due to the Johnson-Reed immigration, leaving Black Americans who left the South in a more favorable position for obtaining industrial jobs, albeit at the lowest and sometimes most dangerous levels. This migration, as well as other developments, lead to a political shift that I call the new Black urban citizenship. Most notable consequence of migration and the new Black urban citizenship is the return of Black interests to the federal policy agenda after a 20-year absence. An example I give here is the introduction of anti-lynching bills in Congress starting in 1918. This really was the first legislation that addressed Black interests since white had left Congress in 1901. So we're really talking about a 17-year interregnum. Dyer picks up this legislative baton. Why? Well, yes, he was personally horrified by lynching, but more importantly, he was motivated by the fact that he now represented a majority Black district in St. Louis. He introduced bills in 1918. The 1920 bill was supported by in the Republican platform. The 1922 bill was filibustered by the Southern Democrats, as was the 1923 and 1924 bill. So again, this is kind of a fundamental change that's happening. But the anti-lynching bills rest upon a new form of political mobilization. The St. Louis Urban League created a program of neighborhood clubs and block units that created local political organizations. This is not to say that this migration, again, is not seen in a positive light. St. Louis is also the home of the new kinds of techniques and practices that will create urban segregation. So redlining, covenants, racial covenants, and all sorts of those types of things. So what happens then is that cities change the rules of the game in inserting new forms of political and administrative structures that provide a durable and hidden substructure that underlies the de facto segregated states outside of the South. The second thing that happens, as a notable consequence of migration, is the election of Oscar DePriest, a Black Republican, who was first elected in 1914 as Chicago's first Black city council member, and in 1929, the first Black elected to Congress since White's departure in 1901. DePriest's election in 1914 wasn't singular. Cleveland elected its first Black city council member in 1911. In addition, scattered small numbers of African Americans were elected in state legislatures in Illinois, Missouri, Ohio, New Jersey, and New York. Again, a far cry from the South, where Black political life had come to an end, given instruments such as the poll tax, the white primary, and of course, violence. This era refounding was capped by the New Deal, where Black urban citizenship and the development of a Black counterpublic leads to a small entree into the executive office. Why? Again, because of Black votes. Where Blacks could vote, they rapidly shifted to the Democratic Party with about 75% of Blacks voting for the first time solidly for Democrats. In fact, this comes back to harm DePriest. He's defeated in 1934 by Arthur W. Mitchell, the first African American to be elected as a Democrat to Congress. This culminates in many ways in June 1941, where President Roosevelt issues Executive Order 8802, which bans discriminatory employment practices by federal agencies and all unions and companies engaged in war-related work. This, in fact, is in many ways the first DEI. I then turn from this moment to what I call the balance of power moment. The balance of power moment, roughly 1945 to 1965, was a strategy built upon Black Americans' experience in World War II and the renewed wave of Black migration outside of the South, fueled by wartime spending and the modernization of Southern agriculture, which pushes African Americans off of the land. Actually, if you could move to the next slide. Excellent. And again, I just want to sort of highlight some of these numbers because the numbers are really just quite remarkable. New York City, for example, in 1948 has 458,000 or so Black citizens. By 1950, 757. Chicago goes from 277 to 492. Philadelphia, 250 to 375. Detroit, 150 to 300, so doubles. And LA, 64 to 200,000. So these are becoming cities with significant Black populations. And the NAACP has seen because its movement and because of the impact of wartime spending, the NAACP saw extraordinary growth during the war years. Its memberships had been buoyed by the Double V campaign, a campaign for victory for democracy abroad, as well as democracy at home. Into this moment steps Henry Lee Moon, African American who had worked for various New Deal agencies and had been an organizer for the CIO, who then becomes the NAACP's director of publicity. He published a book called The Balance of Power, The Negro Vote, in 1948. And he makes it, I think, a really important statement. He says, important national policies and issues may be debated, developed, and formulated on the national level. But in America, they are settled only in the community, back home, in the neighborhoods, precincts, and wards where the people live. So this is an argument that African Americans, though often marginalized, have the potential to act as a balance of power in elections. The idea was that in key swing states or districts, Black voters could tip the scales between political parties, thereby forcing both parties to consider the issues that are important to Black communities. Of course, there was criticism, which was quite valid, that elected officials would more often than not, or possibly more often than not, would betray their campaign promises to support racial equality, and noted that the Republican Party often found support in resistance to civil rights change. Yet this approach, I think, acknowledged the existence and importance of these new Black voters and looked to exploit the pressure points in the American federal system. So the NAACP not only supports litigation in its efforts to dismantle the Jim Crow state, but also voting campaigns in North and South, understanding that courts alone could not create first-class citizenship. So what are the outcomes that we see from this balance of power scenario? First, we begin to see that Black voters are affecting national politics. They help urban machines deliver the urban vote to the National Democratic Party. They push the Democratic Party further to the left of race, further to the left on race, despite the Southern imposition. They influenced Truman's order to desegregate the military and establish the President's Committee on Human Rights. Certainly, the Brown decision in 1954, as well as Eisenhower's actions in Little Rock in 1957, are all sort of made within the context of this sort of newly visible and politically, not, I wouldn't say powerful, but certainly politically visible, the political visibility of Black Americans. Black votes spur the creation of the United States Civil Rights Commission, again established in 1957, whose hearings showcase for the first time non-Southern racial inequality, in particular the systemic or institutional racism at the local level in areas such as education, housing, employment, and policing. Indeed, to harken back to Booker T. Washington's accommodationism, what these hearings revealed is that poor and working class Black Americans had neither a dollar from employment nor a dollar for the opera house. The effect of Black voters at the state level was really even more remarkable. At the state level, they helped give urban politicians an edge in state politics, especially gubernatorial politics between upstate and downstate, or urban and the sort of persistent urban-rural cleavages that had worsened during the early part of the 20th century. They helped spur a mini rights revolution at the state level with subnational civil rights laws enacted across a significant number of states. For example, 31 states between 1945 and 1965 enact public accommodation laws. 28 states enact fair employment laws. 26 states create human relations commissions, and 19 states create fair housing laws. So, and this is all happening at the state level, even as the national level seems somewhat resistant to change. But this leads to what I would call a liberal conundrum. That is, the balance of power creates a dilemma for urban machines that formed one of the building blocks of the New Deal, in that big city mayors are encouraged or find it politically advantageous to be racially liberal on the national stage, but they tended to be racially conservative, if not reactionary, at the local level and in local politics. In fact, if you could just sort of turn that. Okay, so Detroit is an example of this. Detroit increases its Black population by about 29% between 1930 and 1960, from 120,000 to 482,000. Urban renewal is targeting almost exclusively targeting Black neighborhoods. But within this context, someone gets the idea, let's have a march for freedom. Let's march for integration and civil rights in the South. This march, held in June 1963, drew an estimated crowd of 125,000, and at the time it was depicted as the largest civil rights demonstration in the nation's history. And Martin Luther King's speech at the event was a precursor to this I Have a Dream speech that he would give in DC 2 months later in August 1963. The march was attended by Jerome Kavanaugh, the city's liberal white mayor, former Governor John Swainson, and a representative from the then current mayor, George Romney, Mitt Romney's father, Walter Reuther, president of the United Auto Workers, all of whom signaled their strong support for civil rights in the South. Yet there was an uneasiness with this. Even then, there's uneasiness that, well, what's going on in Detroit? How can we think about this inequality in Detroit? How can we think about urban renewal, for example, and inadequate schools? And so what happens next is the organizing of the Northern Negro Grassroots Leadership Conference in November 1963. And appearing at this conference is Malcolm X, who gives his famous his message to the grassroots speech in November of 63. At the same time, the organizers of this conference also create an all-Black Freedom Now party, which advocated for independent Black political action. So there's a sense that the liberal sort of consensus, liberalism itself, really wasn't addressing what was going on in these northern cities. If you just the next. So Detroit is not an anomaly in terms of this kind of this sort of emergence of independent Black political action. Over the next year, school boycotts would occur in Chicago in 1963, where a young Bernie Sanders is arrested, and in New York City as well, and other cities. They all targeted the terrible conditions in Black neighborhoods, overcrowded schools with hostile teachers, where many felt that the goals of the schools were to push young men out onto the street or into the Vietnam War. There were also protests over segregated employment in places like Philadelphia and Newark. And again, more ominously, protests over police brutality and demands for civilian review boards. By 1964, the first of the hot summers in the 1960s would take place with riots in Harlem, Rochester, Philadelphia, and other communities. And there's an interesting Martin Luther King coda to this. That is, King is increasingly pushed to and acknowledges the conditions that are happening in the North. In fact, he says, in the South, we've always had segregationists to help make issues clear. This ghetto Negro has been, the ghetto Negro has been invisible so long and has become visible through violence. So he goes to the North as part of his Chicago campaign. And he has a march. He has a march in July of 1966. This is almost a year after the Voting Rights Act was signed in August 1965. He is marching through a white neighborhood on Chicago's west side where he is struck by a rock. And after the march, he would state, "I've seen many demonstrations in the South, but I've never seen anything so hostile and so hateful as I've seen here today." And really, this is, I think, in many ways, the end of this kind of urban liberalism. So what happens next is what I call Black Power urbanism. And you just switch to the next. I think hopefully many of you know about Black Power. It is, in many ways, politically speaking, it was a challenge to the junior partner status that Afro-Americans had in these sort of urban machines. It was an attempt to address these real issues within these cities in which Afro-Americans are locked out of employment. They are unable to access quality education. They're displaced by urban renewal and highways, and they're overseen by a violent, corrupt, and often unaccountable policing. I'll just note that there was a report on the Newark Police Department, so Newark, New Jersey Police Department, where they found at least half of the police department was actually in the pay of the mafia. So these are deeply corrupt, some of them are deeply corrupt police forces. There's also, so while Black Power was formally proclaimed in 1966, when Stokely Carmichael, or otherwise known as Kwame Ture, proclaimed "We want Black Power" in Greenwood, Mississippi, in practice, a kind of Black Power, what I call Black Power urbanism, was already in formation. This was also pushed by growing voices on the New Black Left, who argued that Afro-Americans had no choice but to take over these cities, and that in the same way that organizers occupied factories, Afro-Americans would actually have to occupy cities in order to advance their interests. So I won't go into it. You can read my book in December. But what does Black Power urbanism mean in practice? It restructures expectations about what a city could or should do. It marries a politics of redistribution with a politics of recognition. It's not just a political revolution, it's a cultural one as well. Black Power meant the improvement of Negro self-image, the idea that Black people and Black culture were each beautiful on their own merits, not on a continuum shaped by assimilation or respectability. The federal system allowed for a vast contestation and experimentation over the meaning and implementation of Black Power urbanism. Here, I think I'm not alone in pushing back against contemporary observers like Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who saw Black mobilization as endogenous to federal spending on community action programs, for example, rather than an exogenous outgrowth of an already contested battle between redistribution and recognition. The federal government directly supports the goals of Black Power urbanism through the Great Society, but also indirectly through Lyndon Johnson's Executive Order 11246 or 11246, in which, and this is from a speech that he gave at Howard University several months before the issuing of this order, where he says that freedom is not enough. You do not wipe away the scars of centuries by saying, now you are free to go where you want, or do as you desire, and choose the leaders you please. You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him up to the starting line of a race, and then say, you are free to compete with all the others and still justly believe that you've been completely fair. So in many ways, then this is the DEI that Trump has vowed to eradicate, this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion. On a sort of more concrete note, the Black Power movement, in addition to the Civil Rights Movement, creates a massive change in Black office holding. In the South, for example, the number of Black elected officials grew from 1,400 in 1962 to almost 6,500 in 1980. Black communities in the South received an average of $1,000 per capita in public infrastructure spending in 1962. By 1980, that average had increased to about 2,000. So the next stage then is what I would say the sort of unwinding of this. It starts with Carter, who has a very complicated relationship with the African-American community. He is running, in many ways, a sort of a proto-Bill Clinton campaign that he is trying to reach out to, particularly Southern whites, as well as whites who would be later, 4 years later after his election, who would be relabeled as Reagan Democrats. In the end, Carter wins over 92% of the Black vote without promising much in return. Black voters had little or no choice between a somewhat conservative white Southern Democrat and Gerald Ford. The balance of power and Black Power urbanism was finished with the decisive win of Ronald Reagan. Reagan accompanied his calls for a new post-Second Reconstruction with an anti-urban policy agenda in which Washington essentially abandoned the cities. From 1980 to 1990, the Reagan administration imposed a 46% cut on grants programs that benefited cities. And this, I think, in many ways creates this kind of cascading effects of this sort of urban the sort of reduction in federal aid, deindustrialization, mass incarceration, all the sort of things that we sort of associate with the sort of decline of cities during the 1980s and 1990s. By the turn of the 21st century, however, a neoliberal urban order emerged, which rested on engineered austerity, mass incarceration, dispossession, and gentrification, and the privatization of public goods like education and affordable housing. In places like, including Newark and Oakland, Black Power urbanism was replaced with Black urban regimes forced to triage the needs of the poor to attend to the needs of local growth machines, and then increasingly global capital. In Black spaces, local officials desperately attempted to compete within a sort of metropolitan political economy for affluent residents and ratables by doubling down on an imagined middle-class identity and a sense of sort of Black uplift. All right, so can you just switch to the next one? So we've arrived in 35 minutes or so to 2000, which is pretty remarkable. And here's where the story of sort of Black politics, I think, gets really fuzzy. And the potential of Black politics gets really fuzzy. What happens in 2000 is first Bush v. Gore, and Bush wins. And this really sort of causes a sort of halt in the sort of DLC, Democratic Leadership Council's attempt to reshape and recenter the Democratic Party, which had led to the success of Bill Clinton earlier. So we end up with George W. Bush and the sharp loss of Carrie Edwards in 2004 and the emergence of what Republicans call value voters and soccer moms. These developments suggest to Democratic Party leadership that it was once again out of step with the median American voter. And so there's a real sense, I think, among the Democrats about what should we do next. And luckily, they're saved by Obama. Obama wins almost 53% of the popular vote and about 68% of the electoral vote. He flips Virginia and North Carolina, but also the red states of Ohio, Indiana, and Iowa. He adds Colorado, Nevada, and New Mexico to the purple column And it really is sort of this miracle. He saves the Democratic Party after 8 years in the wilderness, and certainly after 9/11, which really sort of reshifts many American political priorities. As a result of his election, race becomes salient in ways not seen since the 1960s. Not only the birth that we see of the Tea Party, as well as birtherism, which was embraced early on by Donald Trump, but also the beginnings of Black Lives Matter with the death of Trayvon Martin. And so race becomes a thing. But what does Black politics have to say about it? Not really much. So in this image I have up in the top left-hand corner is an image of Obama's famous beer summit, right? So that an African-American academic was accosted as he's entering into his house. And the sort of response by Obama was to sort of get people together and sort of talk about it, which is great. We should all talk. It's all nice to use your inside voice. But this becomes increasingly generationally out of step. That is, it's only a couple of years after he has the beer summit that the Black Lives Matter movement emerges, who essentially refuse or reject the sort of older generation's attempt to sort of calm things down and sort of come to some sort of accommodation. And so Black politics, I think at this point, is essentially fractured, that there's a new grassroots movement, but a sort of elite of Black elites like Obama, Kamala Harris, who are, I think, increasingly disconnected from what's happening in Black communities and disconnected from a younger generation of voters. So with the election of Donald Trump and the racial backlash he embodied, Black voters ironically though, became the face of Democratic Party redemption. They also reflected the contestation between the sort of left progressive wing of the Democratic Party and more moderates. Sanders, as well as his supporters, saw the future path through a much more explicit socially democratic platform, focusing on raising the minimum wage and Medicare for all, and later a Green New Deal. This approach, in many ways, I think, alarmed the centrists. And so by focusing on Black voters, they have the Black voters called the promise of cloaking old school redistribution policy within a sort of multicultural container that would not upset the professional managerial class of elites and the corporate funders who shaped the Democratic Party agenda. So in many ways, what you get with Obama politics is you get essentially what I would call the third DEI of diversity, the maintenance of difference. Equality of opportunity becomes equity and outcomes, and integration becomes inclusion or recognition of difference. All right, so I'm going to end two more things. One is, first, I would say that Black politics was stalled and weakened as attacks from the right chipped away at the civil rights state. These include decisions like Shelby v. Holder in 2013, which dramatically reshapes the Voting Rights Act. Black politics declines due to the weakening of what we political scientists would call linked fate, the bonds of communal self-interest, due to rising spatial and class deconcentration. That is, Black communities are essentially moving apart and moving away. You can see this in the decline in Black population in major cities. So, for example, New York City lost nearly 200,000 residents between 2000 and 2020. Chicago lost 33%, about 33% of its Black population during that same time. Detroit lost population, but then also lost Black population. LA also lost significant amounts of population. The two anomalies of this is Philadelphia, which actually stayed fairly stable, and Milwaukee, which increased its Black population. And so what this collapse of Black cities has done is really sort of highlighted and made salient the role of Black politics and Black voters. Somehow Black voters have become the way in which the Democratic Party has attempted to redeem itself and to push forward its Black push forward its progressive agenda. But at the same time, as we saw with the election of Harris, younger generations, including men of color, African American men, as well as Latinos, are increasingly distant from this vision of what Black politics has emerged to. Just one last one. And so this is just, again, a sort of a screenshot from an article in the New Yorker, which talks about the sanctification, of Black female voters as this kind of symbol of the ways in which race is sort of deployed as a means of organizing without actually having very much substance behind it. So do I have anything sort of wise to say or uplifting to say? I'm not really sure. Again, we are, I think, in a moment of extreme change. But I do think that hopefully what I've shown is that politics is cyclical, and that what makes a difference is when people can get together and they can organize and engage in political activism. So if anything, to take anything, everyone needs to organize. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Kim.